England in the winter of 1558 was a kingdom trained to listen at doors. For more than 20 years, religion had changed with the ruler, loyalty had become a matter of survival, and the wrong prayer could place a family under suspicion. Henry VIII had broken with Rome, Edward VI had pushed the kingdom further toward Protestant reform, Mary I had restored Catholic worship and burned heretics, and now, on November 17, 1558, Mary was dead. Her 25-year-old half-sister Elizabeth became queen. Outside the royal palaces, church bells rang and bonfires flared. In London, merchants calculated what a new reign might mean for trade. Clergymen wondered which books would be permitted in the pulpit. Noble families hurried to position themselves near the new monarch. Across England, ordinary people knew only that another sovereign had taken the throne, and that the rules might change again. Inside the royal household, however, the change was immediate and physical. Rooms had to be prepared, beds had to be aired, chests had to be unlocked, silver had to be counted, clothing had to be moved from one residence to another, letters had to be carried, fires had to be fed, food had to be tasted, served, cleared, and recorded. The Queen's body itself became part of a vast machinery of monarchy, surrounded at every hour by people whose names rarely appeared in the great political histories of the age. They were the servants of Elizabeth I. Some were aristocratic women serving in the Privy Chamber. Some were grooms, pages, laundresses, cooks, messengers, physicians, apothecaries, wardrobe keepers, musicians, guards and clerks. Some stood close enough to fasten jewels at the Queen's throat. Others carried away chamber pots, washed linen, swept rushes from floors, trimmed candles, cleaned fireplaces, and disposed of the debris left behind after a court that might include hundreds of people had eaten, slept, prayed, argued, danced, and waited. They inhabited a version of royal life that most of England never saw. To the public, Elizabeth would become something almost supernatural, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the radiant ruler of portraits and progresses, a woman draped in pearls and symbols of purity, standing above maps, rainbows, roses, and conquered seas. Her painted face would appear pale and smooth, her hair a brilliant red gold, her gowns so heavily embroidered that the human body underneath seemed to disappear into architecture. But portraits do not smell. They do not cough. They do not sweat beneath velvet. They do not wake in the dark with fever. They do not reveal the stains on linen, the panic before a diplomatic audience, the fear of infection, the pain of a tooth, the exhaustion of a body that has been standing for hours beneath layers of fabric and jewels. Servants saw those things, and what they saw behind closed doors was not necessarily the grotesque secret imagined by later sensational legends. The reality was more unsettling precisely because it was human. Elizabeth's servants lived at the point where royal mythology collided with the vulnerability of flesh. They watched a woman who was expected to represent the stability of a kingdom age, sicken, rage, grieve, distrust, recover, and continue performing majesty long after the performance itself had become physically punishing. The royal household was not private in the modern sense. A monarch's bedroom was political territory. Access to the Queen's body could become access to information, influence, patronage, or rumour. Who entered her chamber mattered. Who helped her dress mattered. Who spoke to her before council mattered. Even who saw her first thing in the morning could matter. Elizabeth understood this from experience. Her childhood had been shaped by danger. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was 2 years old. Her legitimacy was questioned. Under her half-brother Edward VI, she lived through political upheaval surrounding Thomas Seymour, whose behaviour toward the teenage princess created scandal and investigation. Under Mary I, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London and later kept under guard, suspected of involvement in rebellion, despite the lack of proof that could condemn her. By the time she became queen, she had learned one lesson with extraordinary depth. Proximity could be dangerous. So the people admitted closest to her were not merely domestic helpers. They were part of a security system built around a woman who had survived because she learned to control what others knew. Among the most important figures of Elizabeth's private world was Catherine Ashley, usually known as Cat Ashley, who had served as her governess and later as a trusted attendant. Kat had known Elizabeth before the crown, before the jewelled portraits, before the elaborate language of divine monarchy. She had seen the princess as a child and young woman, and therefore possessed something almost no one else at court possessed: memory of Elizabeth before Elizabeth became an institution. Another deeply trusted servant was Blanche Parry, a Welsh gentlewoman who served Elizabeth for decades and became one of the Queen's closest attendants. Parry handled jewels, books, correspondence, and gifts. She stood in that intimate zone where objects touched the Queen's body and then entered the political world. A jewel was never just a jewel. It might be a diplomatic message, a token of affection, a sign of favour, or a reminder of obligation. To serve in such a chamber was to witness constant transformation. The Queen did not simply wake and become royal. Royalty had to be assembled. Imagine the palace before dawn. The corridors are cold despite the fires. The heavy walls hold the night. Somewhere a servant is already carrying wood. Another checks whether embers survived. A page moves quietly past a guard. In the kitchens, the first work has begun. Water is being heated. Bread, ale, and meat are being prepared for a household that never truly sleeps. In the Queen's apartments, access narrows with each doorway. Outer rooms hold people who may wait for hours. Inner rooms admit the trusted. At the centre is the bedchamber, where the body that represents England lies behind curtains. When Elizabeth rises, attendants begin work that is part grooming, part ceremony, part statecraft. Linen touches skin first, then petticoats, sleeves, bodices, farthingales, gowns, ruffs, jewels and accessories build outward. Hair must be arranged, pins must be placed, pearls, chains, brooches and rings must be selected. The process may change depending on the day. Council business, ambassadors, worship, hunting, dancing, a royal progress, or private hours within the palace. The result is not simply clothing. It is armour made of textiles and symbols. For Elizabeth, clothing became one of the most effective political languages of her reign. As an unmarried female ruler in a patriarchal political culture, she could not rely on the conventional image of a king as husband, father, and military patriarch. She created a different visual authority. Her garments expanded her physical presence. Her jewels advertised wealth and international connections. Pearls suggested chastity. Classical and biblical symbols associated her with wisdom, peace, victory, and divine favour. But servants saw the cost of creating that image. A great court gown could be stiff, restrictive, and heavy. Rough collars required careful maintenance and could frame the head like a ceremonial halo while limiting easy movement. Sleeves might be densely ornamented. Pearls and stones added weight. Layers kept the Queen warm in cold rooms, but could become oppressive when fires burned high or when she danced. The body beneath the spectacle did not stop being a body. Elizabeth had been known in youth for physical energy. She rode, danced, hunted, walked, and enjoyed outdoor activity. Foreign observers sometimes commented on her vitality. Yet the Queen's energy itself became part of the burden. A royal progress through the countryside could involve long days of travel, elaborate receptions, speeches, feasts and performances staged by hosts desperate to impress her. Every smile was watched, every delay was interpreted, every visible sign of fatigue risked becoming gossip. Her servants knew when the Queen was tired, even when the court was not supposed to know. They also knew when she was afraid. In October 1562, only 4 years into her reign, Elizabeth fell ill with smallpox. Few diseases could inspire greater terror. Smallpox moved through 16th century communities without respect for rank. It brought fever, pain, and eruptions across the skin. Survivors might be scarred for life. Many died. For a queen with no child, no husband, and no formally settled successor, illness was not merely personal. It was constitutional danger. As Elizabeth's condition worsened, the court confronted the possibility that the young queen might die. Political calculations accelerated. Who would succeed her? Would England return to Catholic rule? Would foreign powers intervene? Would rival claims bring civil conflict? Inside the sick room, those questions had another form. Sheets, sweat, medicine, whispered instructions, anxious faces, and the smell of illness. Servants were there. They carried the objects that touched the infected queen. They changed bedding. They handled cups and cloths. They moved through rooms that others feared to enter. They observed the monarch without the filter of portraiture, when royal skin was inflamed, and royal authority could do nothing to command a virus to leave. Elizabeth survived. The survival became a political deliverance, but it also changed the physical relationship between the queen and her image. Smallpox could leave marks, and later accounts suggest that Elizabeth bore some scarring. Exactly how severe those scars were is difficult to establish, because later writers embellished her appearance, and hostile observers often weaponized descriptions of female aging. Yet the Queen's increasing use of cosmetics, controlled portraiture, and elaborate hairpieces became part of a larger strategy of presentation as she grew older. The famous white face associated with Elizabeth has generated centuries of lurid stories. Cosmetics in Tudor England could include preparations containing white lead, and lead-based face paints were dangerous. One well-known cosmetic, often referred to as Venetian ceruse, was made from white lead treated with vinegar. Repeated exposure to lead can damage the body, but the exact daily cosmetic routine of Elizabeth I is less securely documented than popular culture often suggests. It is easy to take a general practice of the period, attach it to the Queen, and then repeat it until speculation sounds like certainty. Her servants would have known the truth more precisely than we do. They knew which powders were opened, which waters were applied, which ointments were requested, which stains remained on cloth, which mirrors were avoided or demanded, which hairpieces were worn, which jewellery disguised the passage of time. The surviving records allow us only fragments, but the servants saw the entire ritual. That difference between what they knew and what history can prove is one of the most haunting features of Elizabeth's private world. A laundress might know more about the physical condition of the Queen than an ambassador who wrote 10 pages about her. A chamberwoman might recognise pain from the way Elizabeth lifted an arm. A groom might know from the lateness of the morning whether the Queen had slept. An apothecary might understand from the ingredients requested that an illness was more serious than the court admitted. The people with the least political power could possess the most intimate knowledge, and intimate knowledge was dangerous. The Tudor court was a rumour engine. Information moved through servants, secretaries, diplomats, noble households, and foreign embassies. A phrase overheard during dressing could reach a rival faction. A sign of illness could become an international report. A quarrel in the Privy Chamber could affect expectations of royal favour. A servant who repeated too much might lose employment, freedom, or worse. Elizabeth's temper became part of court legend. She could be charming, witty, theatrical, flirtatious, affectionate, and generous, but also sharp, unpredictable, and furious when she believed herself disobeyed. Her attendants did not serve an icon. They served a ruler who could shout, rebuke, strike with words, and occasionally with the hand. Some stories are difficult to verify and were amplified by hostile writers, yet multiple contemporary accounts make clear that Elizabeth's emotional life could be intense. Her anger was not hidden behind the impersonal bureaucracy of a modern office. It might erupt in a room only a few feet wide, surrounded by women fastening a sleeve or presenting a letter. The Queen's closest female attendants lived inside that weather. They had privileges unavailable to most women in England. They wore fine clothes, stood near power, received gifts, helped distribute patronage, and formed connections with great families. But the cost of proximity was surveillance. Their marriages could become political problems. Their pregnancies could become scandals. Their private decisions were not fully private because the Queen considered members of her household part of her personal and political world. Few episodes reveal this more clearly than Elizabeth's reactions when women close to her married without permission. The Queen herself never married, and her unmarried status became one of the central mysteries and strategies of the reign. Parliament repeatedly pressed the question of succession. Diplomats negotiated possible matches. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, remained the great emotional attachment of her early reign. Foreign princes appeared and disappeared as candidates. Yet Elizabeth used marriage negotiations as tools of diplomacy, while refusing to surrender the independence that marriage might threaten. For women around her, however, love could become a trap. When Catherine Grey, sister of the executed Lady Jane Grey, and a woman with a possible claim to the throne, secretly married Edward Seymour, the political consequences were severe. Elizabeth was furious. Catherine was imprisoned. Their marriage raised the possibility of children who might become alternative heirs. Later, other court women who married secretly also faced the Queen's anger. The issue was not simply jealousy, as later romantic storytelling sometimes implies. In a dynastic state, marriage among people close to the succession could be a matter of national security. Yet the emotional force of Elizabeth's reactions suggests something more complicated: betrayal, loss of control, perhaps personal hurt, and certainly resentment of secrets within a household built on her demand for loyalty. Servants saw the aftermath. They saw women return from private audiences pale or crying. They carried messages between rooms. They watched doors close. They watched favourites fall from grace. They learned, again and again, that the royal household could turn intimacy into punishment. This was especially true when the Queen's emotions became entangled with Robert Dudley. Dudley had known Elizabeth from youth and rose rapidly after her accession. He became Master of the Horse, a position that placed him near the Queen during travel, riding, and ceremony. Their closeness was obvious enough to generate gossip across Europe. The problem was that Dudley was married. In September 1560, his wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase at Cumnor Place. The circumstances have been debated ever since. An inquest concluded accidental death, though suspicion of suicide or foul play continued. For Elizabeth, the scandal was devastating. If she married Dudley, enemies could claim she had rewarded a murderer or had somehow been connected to his wife's death. Inside the palace, attendants witnessed the political crisis, not as an abstract diplomatic problem, but as tension moving through rooms. They saw when Dudley was admitted. They saw when the Queen refused to discuss something publicly. They saw changes in her mood. They heard the kind of conversations no ambassador could fully reconstruct. They may have known whether she wept, whether she raged, whether she blamed him, whether she still hoped for marriage after the scandal made it almost impossible. History is full of letters written by men outside a woman's room. Servants stood inside. That was their terrible privilege. And the longer Elizabeth reigned, the heavier that privilege became. The first decade of her rule did not produce the security many hoped for. Religion remained dangerous. In 1559, the Elizabethan religious settlement restored Protestant worship, while retaining enough traditional structure to frustrate some reformers. For many ordinary parishioners, the change meant new services, new oaths, new expectations, and continued uncertainty over what belief would cost them. Elizabeth preferred outward conformity to constant persecution, but plots and international conflict hardened the regime. The Catholic Mary Queen of Scots arrived in England in 1568 after being forced from her own throne. Instead of becoming a guest or ally, Mary became a prisoner. For nearly 19 years, she existed as a rival queen inside Elizabeth's kingdom. That presence transformed the atmosphere around Elizabeth. Every Catholic conspiracy could become a succession crisis. Every intercepted letter might contain a threat. The Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, and finally the Babington plot deepened fears that Mary's supporters hoped to kill Elizabeth and replace her with the Scottish Queen. Security tightened. Sir Francis Walsingham built networks of intelligence, informers, codebreakers, and surveillance. Messages were intercepted, ciphers were broken, suspects were watched. The state became better at listening, but the Queen's servants had always been listeners. They heard the footsteps outside the Privy Chamber. They knew when Walsingham arrived unexpectedly. They saw packets sealed late at night. They noticed when the Queen read a letter twice and then held it near a candle. They witnessed the bodily signs of political pressure, sleeplessness, irritability, long silences, sudden decisions reversed the next day. By the 1580s, Elizabeth had ruled long enough for youth itself to become a political memory. This mattered more than it might seem. The image of the Queen had been built partly around controlled desirability. In her 20s and 30s, marriage negotiations allowed her to appear as the most sought-after woman in Europe, even when she had no intention of marrying. Her femininity could be turned into diplomatic leverage. Her beauty, or at least the language of beauty surrounding her, became part of court ritual. Aging changed the terms. A king could grow old and still embody patriarchal authority. An unmarried queen growing old faced a crueler political gaze. Every wrinkle could become a commentary on fertility. Every tooth lost could become a symbol of decline. Every illness could reopen the succession question. So the private chamber became increasingly important as a place where age was managed before it reached the public eye. Hair was one of the most visible elements of the Elizabethan image. The Queen's natural hair had been reddish, a feature that became iconic. As she aged, wigs and hairpieces helped preserve the familiar royal silhouette. Inventories and accounts show that Elizabeth possessed numerous headpieces and elaborate accessories. The boundary between natural hair and constructed image gradually disappeared from public view. Her teeth were another matter. Sugar had become an elite luxury in Tudor England. It appeared in elaborate banquets, preserved fruits, sweetened dishes, and medicines. Wealthy people could consume far more sugar than the average labourer. Dental hygiene was limited, and tooth decay was common. Elizabeth's teeth deteriorated as she aged. Foreign observers remarked on their condition, sometimes with obvious malice. The servants who stood close enough to speak with her did not need an ambassador's report. They could smell infection if a tooth abscessed. They could see swelling. They might prepare soft foods when chewing hurt. They could notice when she avoided opening her mouth fully, or when a public speech caused pain. A famous story tells of a bishop who allowed one of his own teeth to be extracted in front of Elizabeth to prove that the procedure was bearable, when she feared having a painful tooth removed. Whether every detail of the anecdote is exact or not, the story survives because it captures something profoundly Tudor. Medicine performed in a world without modern anesthesia, where courage could be demonstrated by enduring pain visibly. Tooth extraction in the 16th century could be brutal. Tools were crude by modern standards. Infection remained a risk. Pain relief was limited. A queen could command armies and ambassadors, yet still dread the metal instrument approaching her mouth. Servants saw that contradiction more clearly than anyone. Power ended at the edge of the body. The same was true of menstruation, digestion, sleep, skin disease, aging, and fever. Most details were never recorded because early modern writers considered them either too ordinary, too indecent, or too politically dangerous to preserve. But the absence of records does not mean the absence of experience. It means the people who knew were expected to remain silent. Silence was part of their service, and sometimes silence became the darkest room in the palace. The silence surrounding royal women was never complete, however. It leaked. It leaked through diplomats who bribed informants, through noble families who placed daughters in the Queen's household, through clerks who copied letters, through physicians who spoke cautiously, through servants who moved between residences, and through enemies eager to make the aging Queen seem grotesque. By the late 16th century, Europe's courts were laboratories of observation. Ambassadors were expected to report not only treaties and troop movements, but the ruler's health, appetite, appearance, favourites, and emotional state. A limp could affect markets. A cough could change military plans. A missed public appearance could provoke speculation about succession. Elizabeth lived under that gaze for more than 4 decades. Her servants lived inside it with her. Every royal residence offered a different set of problems. Whitehall Palace sprawled along the Thames, a complex of halls, chambers, galleries, courtyards, gardens, kitchens, stables, offices, and service spaces. Hampton Court, inherited from Henry VIII, combined magnificent staterooms with the practical infrastructure needed to feed and house an enormous court. Greenwich had associations with Elizabeth's Tudor family and remained one of her favoured residences. Richmond, Nonsuch, Windsor, and other palaces formed part of a constantly moving royal world. A palace was not a single clean building filled with quiet luxury. It was a temporary city. Hundreds of people could gather around the Queen. Fires produced smoke and ash. Kitchens produced grease, bones, blood from butchered animals, steam, and discarded food. Horses filled stables with manure, dogs wandered through courtyards and rooms, rushes or matting covered some floors and trapped dirt. Privies and chamber pots demanded constant emptying, water had to be carried, laundry required astonishing labour. Servants prevented royal splendour from collapsing under its own waste. That work was mostly invisible, because successful service meant making discomfort disappear before important people noticed it. A chamber servant rose before the queen, a cook worked before the feast, a laundress laboured before the clean linen touched royal skin, a groom had the horse prepared before the royal party stepped outside. A sewer at table organised service so that dishes seemed to appear in perfect order. A cup-bearer managed drink, a carver handled meat. Pages and gentlemen formed layers between the queen and the disorder that sustained her. The horror, for many servants, was not one secret event, but the endlessness of proximity to need. Royalty consumed work. Consider laundry. Linen was one of the great technologies of cleanliness in early modern Europe. People did not necessarily bathe their entire bodies daily, but clean linen absorbed sweat and oils and could be changed more frequently. For elites, fresh linen was a marker of refinement. Shirts, smocks, shifts, handkerchiefs, sheets, pillowcases, towels, ruffs, cuffs, and undergarments created an enormous cycle of washing, drying, starching, pressing, folding, mending, and storing. A queen's clothing multiplied that labour. The magnificent outer gown that appears in portraits was only the visible shell. Beneath it were layers that had to be maintained. Ruffs needed starch and careful shaping. Delicate fabrics could not be treated like ordinary household cloth. Embroidery had to be protected. Jewels could snag. Perfumes and scented materials might be used to keep garments pleasant in an era when smoke, animals, human bodies, and damp weather constantly invaded interiors. The women who handled Elizabeth's linen knew the queen in a way portrait painters did not. They knew how much she perspired during a dance. They knew whether an illness stained bedding. They knew when repeated wear left a gown needing repair. They knew how often garments were changed before an ambassadorial reception. They knew whether a public appearance required more preparation than usual because the queen had slept badly or felt unwell. That knowledge had no place in the official image. Official Elizabeth barely had a body at all. In the Armada portrait, painted after England's defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the queen sits magnificently dressed, her hands placed over symbols of empire and victory. Behind her, windows show the Spanish fleet in two moments, approaching under ordered skies and then broken by storm. Pearls cover her costume, the crown waits nearby. Her face is controlled, distant, almost mask-like. The actual summer of 1588 was much messier. England expected invasion. The Spanish Armada sailed toward the Channel. Troops were mobilised, coastal defences prepared. Rumours moved rapidly. Elizabeth's council feared not only the fleet, but the possibility of Catholic rebellion at home. At Tilbury, where English forces gathered, Elizabeth appeared before troops and delivered the speech later remembered for the phrase about having the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. The exact wording survives through later versions, rather than a perfect contemporary transcript, but the event itself became one of the defining scenes of her reign. Imagine what her attendants saw before that moment. They saw the clothing chosen for a military appearance. They saw the queen prepare to ride among armed men while the threat of invasion remained real. They knew whether she was frightened. They knew whether her hands shook before she took the reins. They knew what she said in private after reports arrived from the Channel. The public saw courage. The servants saw the preparation required to make courage visible. When the Armada failed, England celebrated. Yet even victory had a private underside. Disease and hunger ravaged English forces after the immediate danger passed. Sailors went unpaid. The state struggled financially. The image of providential triumph was cleaner than the human aftermath. That gap between image and reality widened as Elizabeth aged. In the 1590s, the Queen entered the most difficult period of her reign. War with Spain continued. Conflict in Ireland intensified. Harvest failures and high prices brought hardship. The government faced financial strain. A younger generation at court competed for influence as the Queen's old companions died. Death came closer to the Privy Chamber. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, died in 1588, not long after the Armada crisis. Elizabeth preserved his last letter and marked it in a way that later suggested deep personal attachment. Sir Francis Walsingham died in 1590. Christopher Hatton died in 1591. Catherine Ashley had died years earlier, in 1565. Blanche Parry died in 1590 after decades of service. For Elizabeth, longevity meant surviving the people who remembered her youth. Servants watched the court become populated by ghosts. A chair remained where someone once waited. A jewel had belonged to a dead friend. A familiar voice vanished from morning routines. New attendants entered who knew the Queen only as the aging sovereign from portraits. Loss hardened her. It also made loyalty more precious and betrayal more explosive. The most dramatic example was Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex. Essex was young, charismatic, ambitious, and related to Leicester. He became one of Elizabeth's most prominent favourites in the 1590s. Their relationship combined political patronage, personal affection, rivalry, and theatrical conflict. He wanted military command and greater influence. Elizabeth alternated between indulging and restraining him. Servants in the Privy Chamber saw the relationship at distances the public could not. They saw him enter pleased and leave furious. They saw letters delivered after quarrels. They saw the Queen wait for news from his campaigns. They saw how quickly affection could become anger. One famous confrontation occurred in 1598 during an argument over policy in Ireland. According to a later account, Essex turned his back on the Queen in contempt, and Elizabeth struck or boxed his ear. Essex reportedly reached for his sword before being restrained or reconsidering. Whether every gesture occurred exactly as later described, the story captures the volatile intimacy of their conflict. Here was a nobleman whose status depended on royal favour, acting before a queen who believed his behaviour challenged not only her personally, but the monarchy itself. The servant standing nearby would have understood the danger immediately. No public portrait could show such a scene. The queen who appears frozen in pearls suddenly becomes a woman in a room, furious enough to strike a favourite. Essex's career then collapsed. Sent to Ireland in 1599 to suppress rebellion, he failed to achieve the expected victory and returned to England without permission. Most astonishingly, he rushed to the Queen's private apartments before he had properly presented himself. This moment became one of the most revealing episodes of Elizabeth's later reign. Essex arrived early, travel-stained and desperate, and entered the Queen's bedchamber while she was not yet fully dressed for public appearance. For a court built on controlled access, this was almost an invasion. Later accounts suggest he found Elizabeth before she had completed her morning preparation, possibly with her hair down and without the full cosmetic and ceremonial construction that the public knew. What he saw mattered, because it violated the boundary between sovereign image and private body. At first, Elizabeth received him with surprising calm, but the consequences came later. Essex was confined, interrogated, and stripped of offices. For modern audiences, it is tempting to imagine the scene as the moment Essex discovered some monstrous secret beneath Elizabeth's cosmetics. That interpretation belongs more to Gothic fantasy than evidence. The shock was political and ceremonial. He had crossed into a space where the Queen controlled who was permitted to see her unfinished. Her attendants knew exactly how serious that was. They were the guardians of the transformation Essex had interrupted. They knew the difference between Elizabeth in bed linen and Elizabeth beneath a canopy of estate. They knew that the difference was not deception in the simple sense. It was monarchy. Kings also required dressing, grooming, and ceremonial presentation, but for Elizabeth, the politics of appearance were intensified by gender and age. She had spent decades constructing a visual language in which her unmarried body symbolized the kingdom's independence. To see that body before it had been prepared was to glimpse the machinery behind the symbol. Essex had not merely entered a bedroom. He had walked behind the stage scenery. 2 years later, in February 1601, he attempted a desperate uprising in London. He and his supporters hoped to force access to the Queen and remove enemies from her council. The rebellion collapsed quickly. Essex was arrested, tried for treason, and executed. The Queen, who had once danced with him, argued with him, favoured him, and perhaps loved him in some complicated way, now signed the process that led to his death. Servants lived through the emotional aftermath. What does a queen do in the evening after a former favourite is condemned? Does she eat? Does she speak? Does she ask for music? Does she demand that no one mention his name? Does she ask the same question repeatedly, and then pretend she never asked it? The records rarely tell us. The servants knew. This is where the phrase "behind closed doors" becomes more than a promise of scandal. It becomes a historical problem. The closer we move toward Elizabeth's body and emotions, the thinner the evidence becomes. Private life leaves fewer official documents precisely because privacy is defined by what is not recorded. Later writers filled the gaps with stories. Some claimed Elizabeth's face became grotesquely caked in makeup. Some described blackened teeth and foul breath. Some suggested she refused mirrors. Others invented secret lovers, hidden pregnancies, illegitimate children, or bizarre medical practices. Anti-Elizabethan polemic, Catholic propaganda, Victorian moralism, misogyny, and modern clickbait all contributed to an image of the Queen as a decaying creature concealed beneath white paint and pearls. But history becomes more disturbing when we resist the easiest exaggerations. The Queen did not need to be secretly monstrous. She only needed to be human in a political system that demanded she appear almost superhuman. Her servants saw the impossible distance she had to cross each morning. They saw the older woman and the eternal Virgin Queen occupying the same room. They saw the person and the symbol negotiating with each other in front of a mirror. Elizabeth was born in 1533. By the final decade of her reign, she was in her 60s, an advanced age by the standards of a period when disease could kill at any stage of life. She had survived smallpox, political imprisonment, assassination plots, repeated epidemics, wars, and decades of exhausting travel and performance. Her body carried that history. Pain did not disappear because people bowed. Contemporary observers reported problems with her teeth, changes in appearance, and periods of illness. Her hands and face aged. Her hair thinned or greyed beneath wigs and decorative structures. Her movements slowed. Yet public expectations did not become easier. She still had to stand. She still had to receive ambassadors. She still had to touch petitioners. She still had to dance when dancing projected vitality. She still had to travel when travel displayed royal presence. She still had to reassure a kingdom that had no clear succession settlement. Every time she became ill, servants entered a zone of national anxiety. The Queen's bedchamber could become the most dangerous room in England without a single weapon being drawn. If she died suddenly, factions might move before the news could be controlled. Foreign ambassadors would send urgent dispatches. Possible successors and their supporters would calculate risks. The Scottish King James VI, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, had become the most likely successor, but Elizabeth resisted publicly naming an heir for much of her reign. She believed, with reason, that declaring a successor could weaken her own position. Subjects might begin worshipping the rising sun. So the Queen's body became a state secret. Servants had to manage that secret in practical ways. A physician might be admitted quietly. A meal might be returned uneaten without explanation. A scheduled appearance might be delayed. Curtains might remain closed later than usual. A visitor might be told the Queen was occupied when the truth was that she lacked strength to rise. The court watched these signs obsessively. That meant servants were watched too. A worried expression could become evidence. A hurried messenger could trigger rumour. Even the movement of household officials might reveal what the council hoped to conceal. Elizabeth's private attendants therefore performed another kind of labour, emotional discipline. They had to look ordinary when nothing was ordinary. They had to keep routines functioning when the ruler was ill. They had to speak carefully in corridors. They had to remember that someone was always listening. This was a world in which a servant could be both invisible and politically significant. Foreign diplomats cultivated household contacts because the privy chamber could offer intelligence unavailable elsewhere. Noble families understood that placing a daughter among the Queen's attendants might create an invaluable channel of access. Petitioners sought intermediaries who could place a request in the Queen's hand at the right moment. A woman fastening Elizabeth's sleeve might therefore carry the hopes of a family waiting 50 miles away. A servant might choose when to mention a name. Timing mattered. If the Queen had slept badly, perhaps not today. If a favourite had just amused her, perhaps now. If a council meeting had enraged her, stay silent. Politics could depend on reading the monarch's body. That skill was learned not from books, but from repetition. The tilt of Elizabeth's head, the way she tapped a ring, the speed of her speech, whether she wanted music, whether she asked for a window open despite the cold, whether she dismissed everyone except one trusted woman, whether she remained in the same gown longer than usual. These details were a private language. Servants became fluent in it because their safety depended on fluency. A mistake could humiliate them. A poorly timed request could end a career. A secret marriage could lead to confinement. A careless phrase could travel through the palace faster than the person who said it. And yet the same proximity could create affection. Elizabeth formed long relationships with several attendants. She gave gifts, remembered service, relied on familiar faces, and could show warmth toward those she trusted. The household was not simply a prison surrounding the Queen. It was also the nearest thing an unmarried monarch had to a permanent family. That made death within the household more painful. Blanche Parry's long service is a good example. She entered Elizabeth's life before the accession and remained close for decades. Her monument at Bacton in Herefordshire portrays a woman whose identity was inseparable from service to the Queen. A remarkable embroidered altar cloth preserved at Bacton has been linked by researchers to fabric that may once have formed part of a dress associated with Elizabeth's wardrobe, though the precise chain of ownership remains a subject of scholarly investigation. The object survives because cloth sometimes outlives the body. Look closely at surviving Elizabethan embroidery, and the court suddenly becomes material again. Silk threads, silver gilt, flowers, animals, vines, tiny motifs stitched by human hands. The Queen's image was built from labour that required eyesight, patience, and thousands of hours. Every pearl in a portrait had to be fastened in reality. Every ruff had to be shaped. Every sleeve had to be repaired. Every glove had to be perfumed or cleaned. Every gown had to be stored against damp, insects, fire, and theft. The great irony of Elizabeth's image is that the Virgin Queen, presented as singular and self-contained, was physically produced by a collective. She could not become Gloriana alone. Behind every appearance stood servants, and behind the servants stood other workers who might never see the Queen at all. Dyers, silk workers, embroiderers, goldsmiths, tailors, laundresses, farmers, brewers, slaughtermen, carters, charcoal burners, gardeners, and sailors transporting luxury goods into England. The immaculate royal body rested on an enormous economy of dirty hands. That contrast was visible whenever the court moved on progress. Royal progresses allowed Elizabeth to display herself to subjects beyond London and shift the cost of maintaining the court onto noble hosts for a time. A visit from the Queen was an honour so expensive it could nearly ruin a family. Hosts rebuilt rooms, purchased food, ordered costumes, organised plays, decorated entrances, and prepared gifts. Roads filled with carts. Beds were brought in. Kitchens expanded. Temporary structures appeared. Servants worked until exhaustion. Then the Queen arrived, surrounded by hundreds of attendants, officials, guards, horses, wagons, luggage, clothing, plate, and paperwork. To spectators, it was a vision of national unity. To household workers, it was an invasion of logistics. The Queen's servants had to make an unfamiliar house function like a royal palace almost immediately. Where would the Queen sleep? Which route would she take between chamber and chapel? Could the rooms be secured? Where would meals be prepared? Who controlled the keys? Where could waste be removed without passing through important spaces? Which local servants could be trusted near the royal apartments? Behind triumphal arches and Latin speeches was a relentless question. Where does everything go? That included the Queen's bodily waste. Early modern royal life was more sophisticated than the stereotype of people simply throwing everything onto floors, but sanitation was limited by modern standards. Chamber pots, closed stools, privies, drains and waste pits were part of domestic infrastructure. The groom of the stool had been a famously intimate male office under Tudor kings, involving access to the monarch's private bodily routines and often great political influence. Elizabeth, as a woman, relied on female attendants in equivalent intimate contexts, rather than preserving the male office in the same way. Such work reveals the strange hierarchy of monarchy. The closer a servant came to the sovereign's most undignified moments, the more trusted that servant might need to be. The person handling what everyone else considered filthy could stand nearer to power than a nobleman waiting outside. Behind closed doors, rank inverted itself. A duchess might wait, a chamberwoman entered. An ambassador might beg for an audience. A laundress already knew what the Queen's body had done that morning. That is the private monarchy Elizabeth's portraits cannot show. The private monarchy was also a medical world. A 16th century court had physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, herbal knowledge, household remedies and religious practices, but it did not possess germ theory, antibiotics, modern anesthesia, or reliable diagnosis. Illness could be interpreted through humoral theory, in which health depended on balances among bodily fluids and qualities, such as heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. Treatments might involve diet, purging, bleeding, cordials, poultices, syrups, baths, or compounds made from ingredients that seem ordinary, exotic, or alarming to a modern reader. The Queen's servants stood at the intersection between learned medicine and household care. A physician could prescribe. Someone else had to heat the water. Someone had to bring the cup. Someone had to change the sheets. Someone had to remain in the room after the doctor left. If Elizabeth vomited, fainted, bled, shivered, or could not sleep, the intimate attendants were the first witnesses. Their testimony rarely survives because it was not considered testimony. It was simply work. This is one reason historical accounts of Elizabeth's health are uneven. We often know when illness disrupted politics because ambassadors and councillors wrote about it. We know less about ordinary discomfort that never reached the council table. A queen might suffer headaches without producing a state paper. She might endure constipation without creating an archival record. She might have painful joints, skin irritation, or insomnia that affected the people around her, but left no formal trace. Servants saw history at this scale, not declarations, symptoms. The distinction matters when discussing the cosmetic image of Elizabeth. Modern retellings often begin with a horrifying recipe. White lead mixed with vinegar, spread across the face, poisoning the wearer slowly. The image is powerful because it seems to explain everything. The white face becomes both literal mask and toxic prison. But careful history demands restraint. Lead-based cosmetics existed. They were dangerous. Elizabeth's portraits show an increasingly stylized, pale complexion, yet evidence for the exact frequency, thickness, and composition of cosmetics personally used by the Queen is incomplete. Some later descriptions may reflect hostile fascination with an aging woman rather than neutral observation. Her servants knew what the archive does not. If white pigment was applied, they saw how it was mixed. If scars were covered, they saw the uncovered skin first. If a preparation caused irritation, they saw the redness afterward. If a cosmetic was used only for major appearances rather than every day, they knew that too. History has turned their silence into a blank screen, onto which generations projected their own fears about female vanity. The servants themselves may have understood the cosmetics in a more practical way. Presentation was part of the job. The Queen's face belonged partly to the state. Modern politicians are photographed under controlled lighting, wear makeup for television, rehearse speeches, and rely on teams to construct public appearances. Elizabeth's world was more theatrical and more dangerous. A sovereign's body could be read as evidence of divine favour, fertility, health, and national stability. To conceal weakness was therefore not merely vanity, it could be policy. This is clearest in the Queen's portraits from the later reign. Naturalistic aging gradually gives way to what scholars sometimes call the mask of youth, a standardized youthful facial type repeated even when Elizabeth herself was much older. Her body in these images becomes symbolic space. The dress expands, the face remains smooth. Time seems to stop. In reality, time did not stop. The attendants dressing her could see the difference between image and flesh, increasing year by year. They could also see the emotional cost of that difference. It is impossible to know exactly what Elizabeth thought when she looked at her older face. She had lived in a culture that prized female beauty, especially among women whose bodies were evaluated for marriage and childbirth. For decades, she had turned that evaluation into political theatre. Suitors competed, poets praised, courtiers compared her to Diana, Cynthia, Astraea, and other figures of chastity and celestial authority. But mythology can become a cage. Once the queen was eternally youthful in public culture, ordinary aging became something that had to be managed rather than simply experienced. Imagine an attendant holding a mirror. The room is quiet. Outside, men are waiting to discuss Ireland, taxation, Spain, or succession. On a table lie rings that once fit more easily. Nearby is a wig or decorative hairpiece. A ruff waits to frame the face. The queen is not yet the queen the visitors expect. For a moment, there is only an older woman looking at herself. Then the work begins. The face is prepared, hair is arranged, jewels are chosen. Clothing creates breadth and brilliance. The doors open. Gloriana returns. The horror is not that the face beneath was hideous. The horror is that the woman was not permitted to be ordinary. Even grief had to be managed. Elizabeth's reign was full of deaths that reached deeply into her private life. Some were the natural result of age and disease. Others were political choices for which she bore responsibility. None was more psychologically charged than the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had been Elizabeth's prisoner since 1568. Their relationship was extraordinary. Two queens, related by blood, separated by religion, politics, personality, and circumstance, yet bound by the fact that Mary represented a credible alternative succession. Elizabeth resisted executing her for years. Killing an anointed queen set a dangerous precedent. It also meant executing a relative. But after the Babington plot of 1586 revealed correspondence implicating Mary in plans that included Elizabeth's assassination, pressure increased. Mary was tried and condemned. Elizabeth signed the death warrant. Then she hesitated. The warrant moved through the council and was dispatched. Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle on February 8, 1587. When Elizabeth learned the sentence had been carried out, she reacted with fury and grief, insisting that her councillors had acted too quickly and without her final command. Historians have debated how sincere this reaction was. Perhaps she wanted the execution, but wished to avoid direct responsibility. Perhaps she truly hoped for some alternative. Perhaps both impulses existed simultaneously. Her servants did not have the luxury of historical distance. They saw what happened to the Queen's body when the news arrived. Did her face drain of colour? Did she pace? Did she refuse food? Did she shout at William Davison, the secretary who became the scapegoat for the warrant's dispatch? We know she punished Davison and expressed anger toward councillors. We know the political consequences. But the intimate scene belongs to the witnesses who left few records. This pattern repeats throughout the reign. Public history preserves decisions. Servants witnessed the moments before and after decisions, when certainty broke apart. They saw hesitation. They saw self-doubt. They saw the Queen revise letters. They saw her ask advice and then reject it. They saw her perform anger to control a room and perhaps continue trembling after the room emptied. The court around Elizabeth often depended on her capacity to make men wait. She delayed answers. She prolonged marriage negotiations. She refused to sign warrants immediately. She changed her mind. Councillors complained. Diplomats became exasperated. Modern readers sometimes interpret this as indecision, but delay could be power. A woman surrounded by forceful male advisors could preserve authority by refusing to be rushed. As long as the decision remained hers, the men outside the privy chamber had to return. Her servants saw that tactic in its most mundane form. A counsellor arrives. The Queen is dressing. He waits. Another message comes. She asks who brought it. She continues choosing jewels. The counsellor waits longer. By the time he enters, his frustration has become part of the negotiation. Domestic routine becomes political strategy. Yet delay could also come from fatigue, fear, or reluctance. Servants were among the few who could tell the difference. They knew when she was playing for time. They knew when she simply could not face the paper in front of her. This knowledge made the Privy Chamber an unofficial intelligence centre. The women who served there were not elected officials, but they could become conduits of information and patronage. A nobleman might ask a lady of the chamber to remind the Queen of a promise. A relative might seek help obtaining an office. A diplomat might try to discover whether the Queen favoured one policy or another by cultivating people near her. Female attendants therefore occupied a paradoxical position. The formal political system largely excluded women from office, yet the monarchy itself created spaces where women could exercise influence through access. Elizabeth both depended on and controlled them. She could be intensely possessive of her household. Marriage was the most obvious source of conflict. When an attendant married without royal permission, Elizabeth could interpret it as defiance. The closer the woman stood to the Queen, the sharper the sense of betrayal. One notorious case involved Elizabeth Throckmorton, a maid of honour who secretly married Sir Walter Raleigh around 1591. When the Queen discovered the marriage and pregnancy, both were sent to the Tower for a time. For Raleigh, the consequences were political. For Elizabeth Throckmorton, they were also bodily. A secret pregnancy in the Queen's household could not remain secret forever. Clothing changed, movement changed. Morning sickness or fatigue might appear. Other women noticed, servants always notice. The atmosphere must have been claustrophobic. A young woman living among attendants, knowing that the Queen had not granted permission to marry, carrying a pregnancy that grew harder to conceal each week. Every meal, every fitting, every glance could become dangerous. When the truth emerged, the Queen's anger fell not only on the man who had violated court expectations, but on the woman whose body had made secrecy impossible. Behind the splendour of the Virgin Queen's household, female sexuality was tightly policed. That does not mean Elizabeth hated sex or marriage. She attended weddings, participated in flirtatious court culture, and used romantic language skillfully. But she feared the political consequences of uncontrolled marriage among those near power. Her own life had taught her why. Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry VIII had changed England and ended on the scaffold. Catherine Howard's alleged sexual misconduct had ended in execution. Thomas Seymour's behaviour around the teenage Elizabeth had nearly destroyed her reputation. Catherine Grey's secret marriage had created potential rival heirs. Mary, Queen of Scots, had made disastrous marital choices that contributed to civil war and deposition. To Elizabeth, marriage was never merely private. Her servants lived under that worldview. The Queen could be especially harsh when she believed a woman had hidden pregnancy or marriage from her. Yet the women of the chamber were also the people most likely to help each other through exactly those experiences. They lived together, they dressed together, they slept near one another. They shared gossip, prayers, fears, and family concerns. The household formed networks of solidarity beneath royal authority. Some attendants remained for decades. They aged with Elizabeth. They watched new generations arrive, ambitious and fashionable, carrying rumours from households outside the court. They watched the Queen compare young faces with old friends. They saw patterns repeat: flirtation, rivalry, secret promises, pregnancies, anger, reconciliation. The human density of court life made privacy almost impossible. Rooms were shared. Servants slept in service areas. Corridors carried sound. Doors were guarded, but walls were not soundproof in the modern sense. Fires crackled. Floors creaked. Voices travelled through galleries. A whispered argument might be heard by someone carrying wood on the other side of a partition. Hence the fear of what servants heard. A servant did not need to understand policy to carry dangerous information. Repeating a phrase could be enough. She was crying after he left. She has not eaten. The physician came twice. The Scottish letters arrived. She called for the Earl at midnight. She would not see the council. Each sentence could acquire a political meaning far beyond the speaker's intention. That is why courts generated elaborate codes of discretion. Those closest to Elizabeth learned not merely to serve, but to forget publicly what they remembered privately. And yet people talked. The Spanish ambassadorial correspondence from Elizabeth's early reign contains extraordinary gossip, especially from ambassadors hostile to the Protestant Queen. They speculated about her relationship with Dudley, reported rumours of pregnancy, described court quarrels, and repeated information that may have come through servants and rival factions. Some of it was accurate, some of it was distorted, some was propaganda. The modern historian faces the same problem Elizabeth faced. Information from a palace corridor is valuable because it is intimate, and dangerous because intimacy does not guarantee truth. Servants could lie, they could exaggerate, they could misunderstand, they could be bribed, they could repeat what someone else wanted circulated. The horror behind closed doors was therefore not only what happened there, it was the impossibility of controlling the story once the door opened. Elizabeth spent her reign fighting that problem. She controlled portraits. She controlled access. She used ceremony. She punished unauthorized publications. She answered rumours through symbolic display. She turned her unmarried status from vulnerability into mythology. But she could not control every whisper. No ruler can. The more magnificent the official image became, the more people wanted to know what the image concealed. Did she really love Dudley? Was she scarred by smallpox? Did she fear mirrors? How many teeth had she lost? Did she sleep alone? Did she ever regret refusing marriage? What did she look like before the paint, pearls, wigs, and ruffs? The questions are modern, but the appetite behind them is not. Elizabeth's contemporaries wanted the same thing. They wanted to see behind the curtain. Only servants could. And because most of them kept their silence, the curtain became even more fascinating after her death. After her death, stories about Elizabeth's private habits multiplied because the people most capable of correcting them were gone. Later generations loved extremes. Tudor palaces became filthy nightmares. Tudor bodies became permanently unwashed. Elizabeth became either a dazzling icon of national greatness or a decaying tyrant sealed beneath poisonous cosmetics. Both pictures are easier to remember than the complicated reality. Her servants lived inside that complication. They knew that cleanliness in the 16th century did not resemble cleanliness today, but neither was it absent. Rooms were swept, linen was changed, hands and faces were washed, scented waters were used, clothing was brushed, aired, repaired and stored. Floors might be covered with rushes or woven matting, but those materials were replaced. Privies and close stools existed. Palaces possessed drains, conduits, kitchens, laundries, and specialised service departments. At the same time, by modern standards, the environment could be unpleasant. Smoke from fires and candles accumulated. Open flames blackened ceilings. Damp entered walls. Animals brought odours. Hundreds of people generated waste. Food spoiled more quickly without refrigeration. Fleas and lice were persistent realities across social classes. Human waste had to be carried or drained away through systems that could leak, clog, or smell. River water near cities could be contaminated. Epidemics arrived without anyone understanding microbes. The royal household fought a continuous war against decay with the tools available to it. Servants were that war. They aired chambers before the Queen entered. They moved furniture. They hung tapestries that helped insulate cold walls. They scrubbed, brushed, carried, burned, washed, perfumed, and discarded. They replaced rushes, emptied containers, cleaned hearths, and opened windows when weather allowed. A magnificent palace could smell of beeswax, wood smoke, roasting meat, damp wool, perfume, horse sweat, sewage, herbs and river air within the same hour. Elizabeth's world was sensory in a way modern portraits cannot reproduce. Colour was brighter than we often imagine. Textiles were expensive and saturated with dyes. Gold thread flashed in candlelight. Jewels moved with the body. Music echoed against hard surfaces. Kitchens roared. Bells marked routines. Courtiers wore perfume. Dogs barked. Armour clattered. Boots carried mud into entrances. Pages shouted messages across courtyards. Then, through a guarded doorway, sound could suddenly fall away. The Queen's inner chamber required a different volume. A servant there learned the discipline of quiet movement. A dropped object could become an incident. A door opened at the wrong moment could expose a conversation. A candle going out might interrupt reading. A badly placed cushion might irritate a monarch already exhausted from counsel. The intimate labour of service depended on anticipating needs before they were spoken. This was especially important at meals. Royal dining was surrounded by ritual because food expressed hierarchy, and because poisoning haunted the political imagination of European courts. Historians should be cautious about the popular claim that every mouthful was dramatically tested by a food taster in the way modern films depict. Royal service involved elaborate controls, official roles, careful handling, and ceremonial safeguards, but practices varied. The important point is that food passed through many hands before reaching the Queen, and trust was built into every stage. A kitchen worker slaughtered or received the animal, cooks prepared it, officers supervised portions and presentation, servants carried dishes across corridors, other servants controlled entry to the rooms where Elizabeth ate. The Queen's plate, cups, napkins and utensils were objects of status and security. A mistake could be interpreted as more than a mistake. The fear of poison had deep roots. Renaissance courts exchanged rumours about powders slipped into drinks, toxins hidden in gloves, contaminated food and poisoned rings. Many such stories were fantasies, but the fantasies themselves mattered. A ruler who survived plots did not need to believe every tale to understand that assassination was possible. Elizabeth had particular reason to be cautious. The papal bull Regnans in Excelsis, issued by Pope Pius V in 1570, excommunicated her and declared her subjects released from allegiance. The bull did not create English Catholic opposition, but it intensified the political crisis by allowing the government to portray Catholic loyalty as potentially incompatible with loyalty to the Queen. Subsequent plots involving foreign support and Mary, Queen of Scots, made assassination a persistent fear. For servants, that fear became routine procedure. Who brought the cup? Who sealed the package? Who entered the kitchen? Who had access to the Queen's medicines? Who delivered the letter? A household built on service was also a household built on controlled access. The Queen could never simply accept an object as an ordinary person might. A gift had a sender. A sender had motives. Jewellery might symbolise allegiance. Clothing could contain hidden messages in its imagery. Books might be political. Food could be suspicious. Flowers might carry symbolic meaning. Even a New Year's gift entered a recorded economy of obligation and favour. Servants handled these objects before and after the Queen did. They were the filters between Elizabeth and the material world. Sometimes the filter failed. Letters reached her that caused distress. News arrived faster than anyone could soften it. A favourite entered unexpectedly. An illness emerged before it could be concealed. The political world forced its way into the chamber. Yet Elizabeth also used the chamber to force the political world to come to her. She was famous for conducting business while engaged in activities that emphasised royal control. She might converse while dressing, walking, or moving between rooms. She could keep counsellors uncertain about when a decision would come. Her mastery of languages allowed her to address foreign visitors directly. Her memory for names and details impressed contemporaries. For servants, this meant politics had no fixed office hours. A gown fitting could become a diplomatic conversation. A walk in a gallery could become a council meeting. A musician performing in the evening might suddenly find an ambassador nearby. The Queen carried government with her because government was attached to her person. That made her body a mobile capital. When Elizabeth moved, archives, guards, clothing, food supplies, officers, servants, horses, and petitioners moved with her. Roads churned into mud, inns filled, villages prepared. Noble households panicked over expenses. Royal progress was spectacle from the front and exhaustion from behind. Imagine a servant walking beside a wagon carrying part of the Queen's wardrobe. Rain has been falling for hours. The road is deeply rutted. A wheel sticks. Horses strain. Somewhere ahead, local officials are waiting beneath a decorated arch, determined to greet the Queen as though the entire journey has been effortless. The servant cannot simply announce that the royal gown is delayed in mud. Another outfit must be found, another chest opened, another route taken. Majesty depends on improvisation. This is why the hidden life of a palace cannot be separated from labour. For Elizabeth's servants, behind closed doors was less a fixed location than a moving boundary. Wherever the Queen went, they rebuilt that boundary around her. At a noble house, screens created private routes. At a hunting lodge, familiar attendants guarded unfamiliar rooms. At Windsor, older royal spaces were adapted to current needs. At Whitehall, layers of access could be maintained more easily. The Queen's privacy was an architecture made from people. A door mattered because someone stood beside it. A curtain mattered because someone knew who could pass through it. A secret remained secret because a servant decided not to repeat it. This human architecture became increasingly strained in the 1590s. England's war in Ireland grew costly and brutal. The 9 Years' War, led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, challenged English power. Campaigns failed, soldiers died from disease and hunger. The Crown demanded money. Parliament complained about monopolies. Poor harvests in the 1590s contributed to food shortages and social distress. These pressures reached the Queen through paper, speeches and faces. Servants watched her receive bad news from Ireland. They saw council papers accumulate. They heard arguments about commanders and supply. They watched younger courtiers compete for appointments, while older advisers warned caution. The Queen's private rooms absorbed the anxiety of a kingdom. Meanwhile, the public image became more magnificent. Late portraits expanded Elizabeth into allegory. Her dress became a surface covered in eyes, ears, serpents, rainbows, flowers, jewels, and cosmic symbolism. The Queen appeared less like a mortal woman and more like the idea of sovereignty itself. This was not accidental. An aging ruler with no direct heir required images of permanence. The body weakened, the icon hardened. Servants lived at the fault line between them. They knew the Queen sometimes needed help with clothing too heavy or stiff to manage alone. They knew how long she could stand before asking for a chair. They knew whether she complained of cold. They knew which foods were easier to chew. They knew when pain shortened her patience. Some ambassadors noticed signs of age, but they saw Elizabeth under conditions she controlled. Servants saw her after the audience ended. The difference could be dramatic. A ruler can maintain posture for 20 minutes. Then the door closes, shoulders drop. A shoe is loosened. A ruff comes away. A hand reaches for support. The performance is over, but the body remains. The servant's work begins again. One of the cruelest demands placed on Elizabeth was the expectation that she remain desirable long after marriage was politically plausible. Courtly language continued to describe her in terms of beauty and romantic devotion. Younger men performed admiration. Poets presented her as a goddess. Courtiers competed for attention using the vocabulary of love. Everyone knew the ritual was partly political. The Queen knew too. That did not make the ritual emotionally meaningless. Human beings can understand a performance and still feel what happens within it. Elizabeth had spent her entire adult life turning flirtation into government. A smile could reward, a dance could elevate, a ring could signal favour, a nickname could create intimacy. Jealousy could discipline competing courtiers. Her servants saw the moments when the game stopped feeling like a game. When Robert Dudley married Lettice Knowles in 1578, Elizabeth reacted with fury. Lettice was related to the Queen and had served at court. The marriage appears to have wounded Elizabeth personally as well as politically. She never fully forgave Lettice. Again, later storytellers turned this into a simple tale of a jealous woman. The reality was more layered. Dudley had been Elizabeth's closest male favourite for years. Their relationship had shaped the court. His marriage changed that arrangement without her consent. Servants would have seen what diplomatic reports could only guess. Did Elizabeth ask repeatedly whether the rumour was true? Did she demand to know who had known before her? Did she blame the women around her for keeping the secret? Did she stare at a jewel Dudley had once given her? We cannot know. But we know the household contained the aftermath. The same household had to contain the Queen's reaction when Dudley died 10 years later. He died at Cornbury in September 1588. His final letter to Elizabeth, written shortly before his death, survived among her possessions. She marked it his last letter. A queen who had built political identity around unmarried independence preserved the last words of the man most often imagined as the husband she might have chosen. Servants probably handled that letter. Someone carried it, someone received it, someone placed it where she could read it. Someone later found it among her private papers. The most intimate relics of history often survive because a servant did not throw them away. Objects can become witnesses when people remain silent. Elizabeth's rings were especially charged objects. She gave rings as signs of favour and received them in exchange. Later legend built dramatic stories around particular rings, especially tales claiming Essex tried to send a ring to the Queen before his execution, and that the message was intercepted. The best-known version emerged long after the events and should not be treated as secure fact. But the legend reveals how people imagined Elizabeth's private world. A ring passes from hand to hand. A servant becomes the difference between pardon and death. The Queen waits for a token that never arrives. The story feels believable because everyone understood that access to Elizabeth depended on intermediaries. Servants could change history simply by delivering, or failing to deliver, an object at the right moment. Real life produced less theatrical but equally important examples. Petitions had to reach the Queen, letters had to be placed before her, gifts had to be announced. Individuals seeking patronage needed someone inside the household to speak their names. The Queen's servants therefore occupied a moral grey zone. Helping one petitioner meant ignoring another. Accepting a gift for access could resemble bribery. Family loyalty could conflict with service to the Queen. A woman in the Privy Chamber might receive pressure from brothers, husbands, cousins, and clients, all asking her to influence Elizabeth. The servant closest to the Queen could become the person least free to have a private life of her own. This extended beyond noble attendants. Lower status workers depended on wages, lodging, food allowances, livery, and patronage. Payment could be irregular. Court life offered opportunity, but also precarity. The royal household was a vast employer, but not every worker experienced royal service as glamorous. A kitchen worker might never hear a state secret. What he saw behind closed doors was heat, huge fires, metal pots, knives, carcasses, steam, long hours standing on hard floors. A laundress saw water, ash, soap, stains, and cracked hands. A stable worker saw mud, manure, frightened horses, and the constant demand that mounts be ready. A messenger saw roads, rain, darkness, and the risk of robbery. To say Elizabeth's servants saw horrifying things does not require inventing a hidden chamber of atrocities. They saw the cost of producing royal magnificence. They saw how many bodies had to be exhausted so that one body could appear effortless. They saw inequality not as an economic statistic, but as the distance between the jewel they fastened and the wage they waited to receive. And yet many were proud of royal service. The household gave identity. To serve the Queen was to participate in the state. Uniforms, offices, titles, and proximity offered status. A servant could build a career, secure favours for relatives, and enter networks otherwise inaccessible. Human systems are rarely only oppressive or only rewarding. The Tudor court was both. That ambiguity helps explain why loyalty to Elizabeth could be so intense. She was demanding, suspicious, theatrical, sometimes cruel, and capable of frightening anger. But she also inspired devotion. She remembered old servants. She understood performance and reciprocity. She gave gifts. She joked. She danced. She could speak familiarly with those she trusted. The Queen who terrified a maid one day might reward her the next. The unpredictability deepened dependence. It also made the household emotionally volatile. Modern workplaces separate personal affection from institutional authority imperfectly. Elizabeth's court barely separated them at all. If the Queen loved you, your career rose. If she felt betrayed, your family could suffer. If she was grieving, the mood of the chamber changed. If she was ill, the kingdom trembled. Servants did not work around power, they worked inside its nervous system. This became clearest at night. The public court gradually quieted, but the royal household never fully stopped. Guards remained. Fires required attention. Candles had to be monitored. Messages could arrive after dark. Physicians might be summoned. An attendant slept near enough to respond if the Queen called. Night reduced ceremony. Clothing came away layer by layer. Jewels were removed and counted. Hairpieces were taken down. Pins were collected. The great ruff disappeared. The painted image dissolved into linen, blankets, skin, breath, and darkness. For most subjects, Elizabeth existed as coins, proclamations, prayers, stories, progresses, and portraits. For the servant beside the bed, she existed as a sleeping woman. That may have been the most forbidden sight of all. Sleep did not necessarily bring privacy. A monarch's bedchamber was protected space, but protection required people. Attendants might remain within call, guards controlled approaches. The bed itself, with curtains and rich textiles, formed another chamber inside the chamber, creating warmth and visual separation, but not modern solitude. Elizabeth had spent much of her life surrounded by watchers. As a child, she was watched because she was a royal daughter whose status could change with her father's marriage. As a teenager, she was watched because Thomas Seymour's conduct produced scandal. Under Mary, she was watched because she might become the focus of Protestant resistance. As Queen, she was watched because Europe wanted to know whom she would marry, whether she could bear children, whether she was healthy, and whom she trusted. Even sleep occurred inside a political structure. No wonder control mattered to her. Her habits of secrecy, delay, and guarded access can seem frustrating when read in council papers, but in the bedchamber they become psychologically understandable. Elizabeth had learned that what others knew about her could be turned into a weapon. She protected the smallest signs. This is why stories about her body are so difficult to separate from propaganda. Catholic enemies could present her as sexually corrupt or physically unnatural. Protestant admirers could transform her into a chaste near saint. Courtiers praised her beauty long after such praise became obviously ceremonial. Later historians sometimes repeated diplomatic insults as though they were clinical observations. The servants knew a more ordinary truth. The Queen was neither goddess nor monster. She snored or did not snore. She slept well or badly. She woke thirsty. She needed warmth. She complained. She laughed. She may have prayed alone. She might lie awake after political crises while someone waited silently beyond the bed curtains. The most intimate history is made of details too small to be recorded. Elizabeth's religious life also had a private dimension her attendants would have observed closely. Publicly, she was supreme governor of the Church of England, presiding over a settlement that tried to create outward religious uniformity while avoiding some of the most radical reforms demanded by zealous Protestants. Privately, her beliefs were more difficult to define. She disliked intrusive investigation into conscience. She retained a taste for ceremony, music, and certain traditional forms, while firmly rejecting papal authority. Servants saw when she prayed. They saw which books remained near her bed. They knew whether a religious crisis made her more devout, more anxious, or more impatient with sermons. Elizabeth famously disliked overly long sermons and could rebuke preachers who ventured into political subjects she believed belonged to the crown. Bishops might imagine themselves guardians of doctrine. The Queen reminded them who controlled promotion. The household saw the human side of these confrontations. A bishop leaves an audience chastened. Elizabeth mimics a phrase after the door closes. An attendant suppresses a smile. Then another visitor enters, and the Queen's face changes instantly. The ability to shift roles was one of Elizabeth's great political talents. She could be scholar, flirt, mother of the nation, warrior prince, pious monarch, offended woman, forgiving mistress, or furious sovereign, depending on what the moment required. Servants saw the transitions. That is something portraits cannot capture. Not the face, but the speed with which one face replaced another. She had been educated to an extraordinary standard. Elizabeth knew Latin, French, Italian, and other languages to varying degrees, translated classical and religious works, and could engage learned visitors directly. Her education gave her another form of defence. In a court where men might underestimate a woman, she could answer them in their own intellectual language. Yet scholarship did not protect her from the repetitive indignities of age. By the late 1590s, Her household had to reconcile an official culture of timeless beauty with increasingly visible physical limitation. Teeth remained a problem. Reports from foreign observers mention missing or blackened teeth, though some accounts were unkind by intention. Tooth decay could alter speech. At close range, an ambassador might struggle to understand her, especially when court music, large rooms, accents, and formal language already complicated communication. Servants stood closer. They adapted. A cup placed differently, food cut smaller, a word repeated without calling attention to difficulty. A pause allowed while the Queen caught her breath. The most skilled service disappears into the illusion that no help was needed. That illusion was central to monarchy. A ruler who constantly required visible assistance risked looking weak. Elizabeth's attendants therefore practiced a choreography of support without humiliation. A hand could be offered as though part of a dance. A chair could appear before she needed to request it. A heavy train could be lifted at the exact moment she turned. Stairs could be approached slowly while conversation distracted observers. The Queen's aging body was carried by etiquette. This is one of the reasons ceremonial courts developed such complex rules. Ceremony did more than display hierarchy. It allowed physical realities to be managed without naming them. The same was true of emotion. By 1601, Elizabeth had survived almost everyone who had been central to her early reign. Her kingdom was still at war. The Essex Rebellion had forced her to confront treason from a man she had favoured. Parliament was angry about monopolies, exclusive rights granted by the Crown that could raise prices and enrich patentees. In November 1601, Elizabeth addressed the members of Parliament in what became known as the Golden Speech. She spoke of the love of her subjects as her greatest treasure and emphasised the mutual bond between Queen and people. The speech became famous because it sounded like farewell, even though she still had more than a year to live. Publicly, it was one of her finest performances. Behind the scenes, attendants knew what effort performance now required. They saw the preparation before Parliament. They knew whether she rehearsed phrases. They knew if her hands were cold. They knew whether she returned from the audience energized by applause or exhausted by the strain. The public speech survives. The private silence afterward does not. This imbalance shapes nearly everything we think we know about rulers. Their words are preserved when spoken before witnesses of status. Their bodies are preserved only when someone thought the body politically relevant. Their servants disappear because the servant's job was to make the ruler appear independent of them. But Elizabeth's final years make that illusion impossible to sustain. An old monarch depends increasingly on those who help her rise, dress, eat, move, sleep, and endure. The political paradox was severe. Elizabeth had made refusal a form of sovereignty. She had refused to marry when pressure was greatest. She had refused to name a successor. She had refused to be controlled by Dudley, Parliament, bishops, foreign princes, or impatient councillors. But age is a form of pressure no sovereign can negotiate away. Her attendants became witnesses to surrender in tiny stages: a longer rest, a shorter dance, a delayed audience, a meal barely touched, a reluctance to travel, a night without sleep, a day when the jewels seemed too heavy. No single moment announced the decline. That is rarely how aging works. Instead, the impossible image of permanence became harder to maintain. Court culture responded by becoming even more symbolic. Elizabeth appeared in portraits with celestial imagery, rainbows, suns, moons, and embroidered eyes. The body itself became less naturalistic as its political symbolism increased. Her skin could be painted without visible lines of age. Her waist could be compressed into geometry. Her dress could occupy more space than her face. The older the woman became, the less human the portrait allowed her to appear. Servants experienced the reverse. The older she became, the more human their work became. That contrast reaches its darkest point in the winter of 1602 to 1603. The Queen entered her 69th year. By then, many at court were quietly preparing for the future, even though openly discussing the succession remained delicate. James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, was the obvious candidate to succeed. English politicians and Scottish agents maintained channels of communication. Robert Cecil, one of Elizabeth's most important ministers, corresponded secretly with James to help ensure a smooth transfer when the time came. Elizabeth was still alive while men prepared for a world without her. Servants could feel that change, even if no one spoke it aloud. A court preparing for succession has a particular cruelty. People continue bowing to the old ruler while calculating their position under the next. Gifts are still presented, petitions are still offered, compliments still describe immortal beauty. But glances drift north towards Scotland. Elizabeth, who had spent her life refusing to name the person who would inherit her throne, could hardly have been unaware. Her attendants may have noticed whom she trusted less, which letters irritated her, which courtiers suddenly seemed too eager to leave, and which old servants clung more closely to familiar routines. The Queen had become the only person in England who could not openly participate in the political conversation everyone knew was coming. To name James too clearly could make her a living predecessor. To refuse all discussion could not stop time. So the household continued the rituals of permanence. New Year's Day remained an important gift-giving occasion at court. Courtiers presented valuable objects to Elizabeth and received gifts in return. The exchange displayed hierarchy and loyalty. Records of these gifts provide glimpses of the extraordinary material world surrounding her: jewels, clothing, gold, silver, embroidered objects, and money. Imagine the final new year of her reign. Objects arrive as though the future were endless. A jewel meant to last generations is placed before a woman with months to live. A servant records it, another carries it away for storage. The ritual is almost unbearable in retrospect, but no one experiences life in retrospect. The attendants did not know the exact day death would come. They only knew the Queen was changing. During the final months, contemporary reports describe melancholy and declining health. The causes remain uncertain. Some accounts mention throat problems, weakness, loss of appetite, and depression. Later writers offered specific diagnoses, but certainty is impossible. What is clear is that Elizabeth withdrew increasingly from the energetic public life that had defined her. Her servants saw the withdrawal room by room. A door that once opened remained closed. Music no longer lifted the mood. Food returned untouched. The Queen sat longer in silence. Old griefs seemed to gather around her. Some later accounts claim she became deeply affected by the deaths of friends, including Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham, though stories connecting that death to the legendary Essex ring are not reliable. What matters is that Elizabeth had reached an age when bereavement had become cumulative. Her private household had become an archive of absence. Cat Ashley was gone. Blanche Parry was gone. Leicester was gone. Walsingham was gone. Hatton was gone. Essex was dead by her authority. Mary Queen of Scots was dead by a warrant she had signed. Many of the people who remembered the frightened princess in the Tower were gone. The remaining servants faced a queen surrounded by memory. Memory can be worse at night. A portrait does not tell us whether Elizabeth dreamed of her mother. No reliable source records whether she imagined Anne Boleyn's final days, or Mary's execution, or Essex on the scaffold. It would be irresponsible to invent certainty. But servants did witness sleeplessness and melancholy in royal households, and Elizabeth's final decline was marked by reports of profound sadness. A sovereign can command that no one speak of death. She cannot command memory to obey. By March 1603, the court moved toward Richmond Palace, one of the Queen's favoured residences. There, the final boundary began to collapse. At Richmond, the machinery of monarchy kept moving because machinery does not know how to grieve. Meals were still prepared, guards still took positions, messages still arrived, officials still waited, fires still needed fuel, clothing still had to be laid out, even when the Queen no longer wished to wear the full burden of ceremony. The servants continued because routine was one of the last defences against what everyone feared. Accounts of Elizabeth's final illness differ in detail, and later retellings often sharpen them into melodrama. One frequently repeated story says that she refused to go to bed, sitting or standing for long periods on cushions, because she believed that lying down would mean surrendering to death. Contemporary reports do suggest an unusual reluctance to take to her bed during the final illness, though the exact motives attributed to her are less certain. For servants, the distinction between legend and fact would have been irrelevant. They were the ones placing cushions. They were the ones watching her remain upright. They were the ones trying to persuade an exhausted woman to rest. The image is powerful because it fits Elizabeth's entire life. She had survived by refusing to yield. She refused Seymour's shadow over her reputation. She refused Mary's interrogators the confession they wanted. She refused Parliament's attempts to dictate her marriage. She refused foreign princes the certainty of an answer. She refused counsellors who pressed too hard. She refused to name an heir. Now the body itself demanded surrender. And perhaps, for a time, she refused that too. In the final chamber, all the symbols of monarchy must have seemed increasingly useless. A crown could not lower fever. Pearls could not restore appetite. A ruff could not make breathing easier. A title could not return lost strength. If she was suffering from infection, bronchial illness, tonsillar problems, or some combination of ailments, 16th century medicine had little to offer beyond supportive care and remedies of uncertain value. The attendants were left with the oldest form of medicine in the world: presence. Stay near. Keep her warm. Bring drink. Adjust the cushions. Call the physician. Wait. There is something almost cruel in how royal illness compresses an empire into a room. Outside Richmond Palace, England continued. Farmers prepared fields. Ships moved along the coast. London merchants opened shops. Parish bells rang. Children were born who would never remember Elizabeth alive. Inside, the future of the monarchy depended on whether one elderly woman inhaled again. Every breath became political. Councillors needed to know whether she could speak. Messengers needed instructions. James of Scotland's supporters watched for news. The City of London had to be kept calm. The servants near the Queen's body carried information that could change a kingdom simply by walking out of the room. If one emerged crying, observers might understand before any proclamation was made. So even grief required discipline. This is one of the most frightening aspects of royal service. There are moments when the servant must feel nothing publicly because everyone is watching for feeling. A maid who loved the Queen could not collapse in a corridor. A gentleman of the household could not whisper confirmation to a friend. A physician could not shrug. Until the political machinery was ready, the private truth had to remain contained. Elizabeth's ability to communicate declined. Later accounts say councillors pressed her to indicate the succession and that she signalled acceptance of James VI of Scotland. The exact form of any final nomination is debated. What followed, however, was remarkably smooth by the standards of Tudor succession crises. After Elizabeth's death, James was proclaimed King of England as James I. The lack of open civil conflict was no accident. Men around the Queen had prepared, but servants had maintained the appearance that preparation was unnecessary. That was the final service to Elizabeth's lifelong policy of refusing to be replaced before she was dead. In the early hours of March 24, 1603, Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old and had ruled for more than 44 years. For most people alive in England, she was the only monarch they clearly remembered. The political transformation was immediate. The personal transformation was stranger. One moment the body in the bed belonged to the Queen of England. The next, it was the corpse of Elizabeth Tudor. The difference was legal, ceremonial, emotional, and absolute. Servants were there when the magic of monarchy stopped. They had spent decades treating her body as sacred political space. Doors had opened because she approached. Men had knelt. Food had been carried according to ritual. Clothes had been constructed around her. Portraits had denied time. Foreign governments had recalculated policy because she coughed. Now the body could not command anyone. Yet the servants' duties became even more intimate. A royal corpse had to be prepared for lying in state and funeral rituals. Early modern royal funerals could use effigies to represent the sovereign publicly, while the actual body remained enclosed. Elizabeth's funeral would become a magnificent display of continuity, mourning, and national memory. But before magnificence came work. The chamber had to be managed. The body had to be handled according to custom. Clothing and textiles had to be chosen. Rooms had to be secured. Officials had to be informed. Inventories and property questions began immediately. The household that had existed around a living queen suddenly faced dissolution and transfer. This was a terrifying practical reality for servants. A royal death did not only end a reign, it threatened employment. Some servants might continue under James, others would lose positions. Patronage networks built over decades could vanish overnight. A woman who had spent 30 years mastering Elizabeth's moods now possessed a skill no new king required. The most intimate expertise in England had become obsolete before breakfast. Imagine an attendant standing in the room after death. For years she had known exactly how Elizabeth liked her sleeve fastened, which scent displeased her, when to offer a cushion, which name not to mention during an angry morning. Now none of it mattered. The servant knows more about the dead queen than the new king ever will, but the new king owns the future. News moved quickly. James VI of Scotland was proclaimed James I of England, joining the crowns under one monarch. He began his journey south. Courtiers who had spent decades orbiting Elizabeth redirected themselves toward the new centre of gravity. The transformation could be brutally fast. Yesterday, men competed for one glance from Elizabeth. Today, they practiced the language they would use before James. Servants saw that too. They saw loyalty change costumes. They saw people who had praised the Queen as incomparable begin calculating which Scottish favourites mattered. They saw rooms cleared and offices reassigned. They watched an age end not with a thunderclap, but with keys changing hands. Elizabeth's body was carried from Richmond toward London by water. Contemporary reports describe crowds mourning as the funeral procession later moved through the city. Her funeral took place on April 28, 1603, at Westminster Abbey. An effigy represented the Queen in royal magnificence. Once again, the public saw an image. The real body was hidden. Even in death, Elizabeth existed twice. There was the physical woman, aged, dead, enclosed. And there was the Queen, visually restored, crowned, dressed, presented to the people. The servants had spent a lifetime managing exactly that division. The funeral made it permanent. Elizabeth was buried in Westminster Abbey. Years later, James I placed her in a grand tomb shared with her half-sister Mary I, the Catholic queen whose reign had once imprisoned Elizabeth and nearly ended her life. The irony is extraordinary. Two sisters divided by religion, politics, succession, and memory lie beneath the same monument. One inscription and one tomb compressed decades of fear into stone. But the servants who carried their private worlds have no comparable monument. Some have memorials of their own. Blanche Parry's tomb survives at Bacton. Cat Ashley appears in records and letters. High-ranking attendants can be reconstructed through family papers and household accounts. Most others remain names in lists or disappear entirely. The laundress who handled stained linen is gone. The page who carried a message after midnight is gone. The woman who steadied Elizabeth on a difficult morning is gone. The servant who first realized the Queen would not recover may have left no trace. This absence has consequences. When the witnesses disappear, myth enters. In the centuries after Elizabeth's death, writers transformed her private life according to their own needs. Protestant history celebrated the defender of England. Romantic writers imagined secret loves. Catholic polemic remembered persecution. Victorian authors judged her femininity. Modern popular culture became fascinated with cosmetics, virginity, teeth, wigs, and rumours of concealed decay. The phrase, "behind closed doors," became an invitation to assume the official image must have concealed something monstrous. But the surviving evidence suggests a more complex truth. Elizabeth certainly concealed weakness. She managed access to her body. She controlled portraits. She used cosmetics and elaborate dress as part of presentation, though later claims about exact substances and routines often outrun documentation. She had dental problems. She bore the physical consequences of age and illness. She could be furious with attendants. She punished secret marriages. She lived in fear of plots. She made decisions that led to imprisonment and execution. None of this requires a fictional mask falling off to reveal horror. The horror was already present in the system. It was present in the fact that a woman's aging face could become a matter of national security. It was present in servants who could lose everything for repeating what they saw. It was present in young attendants whose marriages were subject to royal anger. It was present in the execution warrant for another queen. It was present in the court's need to praise eternal youth while privately preparing for death. It was present in the transformation of human vulnerability into political weakness. It was present in the endless labour required to make one person appear effortless. That is what Elizabeth's servants saw. They saw the cost of the icon. And because they stood so close, they also saw something more sympathetic than the icon allowed. They saw courage that was sometimes fear performed successfully. They saw authority that depended on preparation. They saw intelligence operating alongside insecurity. They saw vanity mixed with strategy. They saw anger mixed with loneliness. They saw an unmarried queen surrounded by hundreds of people and still capable of extraordinary solitude. The loneliness of Elizabeth's position is easy to underestimate because her court was crowded. But crowds are not the opposite of loneliness. A ruler cannot speak freely to everyone who smiles. A favourite may want office. A counsellor may be testing policy. A suitor may represent a foreign government. A cousin may possess a claim to the throne. A servant may be loyal, bribed, frightened, ambitious, or related to someone seeking patronage. Every relationship contains politics. The Queen's most private moments, therefore, occurred among people she could never entirely stop being queen around. Even Cat Ashley, who had known her as a child, served as sovereign once Elizabeth took the throne. Even Dudley, whatever his emotional importance, depended on royal favour. Even a physician treating pain had to address the Queen. There may have been no room in which Elizabeth could become simply Elizabeth for very long. Her servants came closest to seeing it. That may be why later generations have been so fascinated by the morning dressing chamber. The scene promises revelation. Remove the crown. Remove the wig. Remove the pearls. Remove the painted face. Remove the gown. Surely, we imagine, the real woman must be underneath. But identity does not work so neatly. The crown was part of Elizabeth. The cosmetics were part of Elizabeth. The speeches were part of Elizabeth. The fear was part of Elizabeth. The private body was real, but so was the performance. She had been performing monarchy since the age of 25. After 44 years, the performance had shaped the performer. Servants did not witness a fake queen hiding a true self. They witnessed many selves layered together. The scholar translating texts, the young woman riding beside Dudley, the survivor scarred by illness, the sovereign raging at a secret marriage, the Protestant ruler resisting Catholic plots, the daughter of Anne Boleyn avoiding discussion of her mother, the prisoner who remembered the Tower, the commander riding before troops at Tilbury, the ageing woman beneath a youthful portrait, the lonely monarch preserving Leicester's last letter, the dying queen refusing, perhaps, to lie down. All were Elizabeth. The servants saw them overlap. Their world therefore challenges the way history is usually told. History prefers moments that can be dated. November 17th, 1558, accession. February 8th, 1587, Mary executed. 1588, Armada. February 25th, 1601, Essex executed. March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth dies. But servants lived in the spaces between dates. They lived through the morning after the execution, the night before the speech, the hour when the Queen could not sleep, the 5 minutes during which an ambassador waited while a broken clasp was repaired, the silence after a letter was read. These moments rarely enter chronicles, yet they are where human experience happens. A reign is not 44 years of proclamations, it is more than 16,000 mornings. Someone opened the curtains on each one, someone lit the fire, someone brought water, Someone prepared clothes. Someone waited outside the door. That repetition is the hidden architecture of Elizabethan monarchy, and it explains why her servants could know things no historian ever will. What the historian can recover now comes from fragments that were never meant to tell this story alone. Household accounts list payments, inventories list objects, diplomatic dispatches report rumours, letters preserve requests, anger, affection, and political calculation. Portraits preserve an official face. Monuments preserve the names of a privileged few. Taken separately, each source is incomplete. Put together, they allow us to reconstruct the outline of a world that once surrounded Elizabeth every hour. That world was populated by people like Blanche Parry, whose long service placed her close to the Queen's person and possessions. Parry was not merely standing silently in the background of great events. She managed access, objects, information, and relationships. Her closeness to Elizabeth gave her influence, but also responsibility. Every valuable item entrusted to her had to be accounted for. Every person seeking favour through her created a potential obligation. Cat Ashley represented something even more intimate: continuity with the Queen's vulnerable past. When Elizabeth was young, Cat had helped oversee her education and household. She was present during the dangerous Seymour episode, when the behaviour of the Lord Admiral Thomas Seymour toward the teenage Elizabeth generated an investigation that could have destroyed the princess politically before she ever approached the throne. Elizabeth learned then how quickly domestic behaviour could become public evidence. What happened in bedrooms and corridors was not private life in the modern sense. It could determine legitimacy, reputation, marriage prospects, imprisonment, or death. That lesson never left her. Her later obsession with controlling the marriages and sexuality of women around her looks less strange when seen against this background. She knew that one whispered story about a woman's body could become a political weapon. She had been that woman. Her servants therefore worked for someone whose fear of exposure had been educated by experience. The Queen's suspicion was not imaginary, even when it became excessive. She had been interrogated. She had been imprisoned. She had watched relatives and stepmothers fall from favour. She had lived in a dynasty where marriage could alter the religion of a kingdom, and allegations of adultery could end with an axe. The Tudor household had always been political territory. Elizabeth simply mastered it more completely than most. Her control of the Privy Chamber allowed her to govern through access. A person excluded from the inner rooms might possess a title but lack influence. A trusted attendant with no formal seat on the council might deliver a sentence at exactly the right moment and change the Queen's mood. This was soft power in a literal soft space. Textiles, cushions, gowns, beds, gloves, handkerchiefs, and whispered conversation. The masculine language of state papers can make Tudor government look as though it happened entirely at council tables. It did not. Some of it happened while the Queen's hair was being arranged. Some happened while she walked through a gallery. Some happened over music. Some happened when an attendant carried a petition into a room where its author was not allowed to go. The servant who crossed the threshold became part of politics. This is especially important because Elizabeth's reign has often been interpreted through the men around her: Cecil, Walsingham, Dudley, Essex, Raleigh, Drake, Hawkins, and others. They mattered enormously, but the inner household reminds us that women also surrounded the machinery of rule. Ladies and gentlewomen could influence access, carry news, preserve relationships, and manage the Queen's emotional environment. Their power was informal, which made it easy for later histories to ignore. Informal power leaves informal evidence. A formal office generates documents. A timely whisper may generate none. This means the archive itself favours the council chamber over the bedchamber. The servants' world survives as shadows at the edge of someone else's letter. An ambassador complains that he cannot gain access. Why not? Perhaps the Queen is ill. Perhaps she is angry. Perhaps an attendant has advised waiting. Perhaps Elizabeth simply wants him to suffer uncertainty. The document records only the frustration outside the door. The reason remains inside. That invisible threshold is the central mystery of Elizabeth's reign. She turns secrecy into strength. She rarely allowed one faction to feel completely secure. She balanced advisors. She kept marriage possibilities alive long after others expected a decision. She used ambiguity in diplomacy. She understood that an answer, once given, could be used against her. Servants watched the cost. Ambiguity requires constant maintenance. A woman pretending to consider marriage must continue receiving courtship. A queen refusing to name an heir must keep everyone uncertain. A ruler projecting health must appear when she would rather rest. A monarch claiming control must conceal moments when events terrify her. The performance cannot stop because the audience is always present, and the closest audience is the household. Imagine one ordinary day in the middle of the reign. The queen wakes before the palace fully brightens. A servant opens the bed curtains. Another brings water. The fire is revived. Outside, petitioners are already gathering. A secretary has urgent papers. Somewhere in the kitchens, hundreds of meals are being prepared for people attached to the court. Elizabeth has slept badly. Her attendants know immediately. Nothing dramatic has happened. No assassin waits. No scandal has erupted. But the morning carries danger because a tired queen is an impatient queen. A lady decides not to mention her cousin's request for an office. A gentleman outside is told to wait. The queen chooses a gown, rejects it, chooses another. A jewel catches on fabric. Someone apologizes. For a second the room freezes. Then Elizabeth laughs. Everyone breathes again. By noon she is receiving a foreign envoy and appears entirely composed. The envoy writes home that the queen seemed vigorous. Both accounts are true. That is the servant's history. Now imagine another day in 1562. The room is hotter than usual because the queen has fever. Bedding is changed. Faces are tense. Smallpox has erupted. Someone outside asks whether Her Majesty will receive visitors and is told, no. Inside there is no Gloriana. There is a young woman fighting a disease that has killed thousands without caring whether they were royal. An attendant handles the same cloth that touched infected skin. She knows she may fall ill next. She stays. That is service too. Now another day, decades later. Elizabeth is older. A tooth hurts. Speaking is difficult. A young courtier praises her beauty with extravagant language. She smiles because that is what the ritual demands. An hour later, in private, the smile disappears. A servant brings something soft to eat. The courtier remembers the smile. The servant remembers the pain. Which witness knew the queen better? Neither saw everything, but one stood closer to the body. The body is where royal mythology becomes hardest to sustain. Elizabeth's reign coincided with a cultural explosion that later generations would call the Elizabethan Age. The plays of Shakespeare and his contemporaries, the poetry of Spenser, maritime expansion, new forms of commerce, conflict with Spain, colonizing ventures, and the growth of London. The Queen became the face of an era so large that the woman herself can disappear behind it. Servants return scale to the story. To them, the Elizabethan age could be one stained sleeve, one delayed meal, one sleepless night, one dangerous letter, one royal hand suddenly cold. This does not diminish Elizabeth's historical importance. It makes that importance physical. A state is always embodied in work. Policies require messengers, diplomacy requires rooms, war requires supply, ceremony requires clothing. Power requires someone to keep the candle burning long enough for the ruler to read. When we focus only on Elizabeth, we risk reproducing the illusion her court worked so hard to create, that the Queen generated magnificence by herself. She did not. Her sovereignty depended on thousands of acts performed by other people. Some of those acts were intimate enough to be uncomfortable. A servant might see the Queen undressed. Another might handle menstrual linen during the years when that was relevant, though specific surviving records rarely allow us to reconstruct such routines for Elizabeth personally. Another might dispose of vomit during illness. Another might inspect bedding for signs of fever. Another might clean a cosmetic stain. Another might carry away a chamber pot. These are ordinary human acts, but monarchy made them secret because the political image depended on separating the queen from ordinary bodily need. The secrecy itself created later horror stories. When people are told they cannot see something, they imagine the hidden thing must be shocking. Often, what is hidden is simply vulnerability. The same mechanism operates today. Public figures are photographed after preparation. Their illnesses become subjects of speculation. A visible stumble can dominate news. Teams manage lighting, clothing, schedules, security, and access. The public sees the finished appearance and becomes fascinated by the possibility of seeing the unguarded person. Elizabeth's court was an early and extreme version of this logic. The difference was that her physical condition could influence succession, religion, war, and the balance of power in Europe. Her face was not merely a face, it was evidence. Her servants therefore helped edit evidence before it reached the world. That did not necessarily mean deception, it meant selection. Which gown today? Which visitors admitted? Which illness acknowledged? Which rumour denied? Which portrait approved? Which sign of ageing softened? Every court performs this selection. Elizabeth's did it with extraordinary discipline because the Queen's political survival depended on it. The system worked so well that the official image survived the body. Most people today recognise Elizabeth not from a realistic late-life likeness, but from the symbolic Queen. Red hair, white face, enormous ruff, pearls, jewelled gown. The servants won. The performance became history. Yet traces of the private world remain. At Hampton Court, visitors can still walk through Tudor spaces and feel the scale of royal architecture, though many rooms have changed over centuries. The kitchens reveal the enormous logistical system required to feed a court. They remind us that royal life depended on fire, meat, storage, carrying, and labour. Whitehall Palace, once a primary centre of Elizabeth's government, largely vanished after a devastating fire in 1698. The surviving banqueting house belongs to the later Stuart period, so the physical maze Elizabeth knew has mostly disappeared. Richmond Palace, where she died, is also largely gone. Greenwich Palace, where Tudor monarchs spent important periods and where Elizabeth was born, no longer stands in its Tudor form. The disappearance of the buildings is strangely appropriate. The private rooms were designed to control access even when they existed. Now they are absent altogether. We approach them through maps, archaeology, inventories, pictures, and imagination. Westminster Abbey offers a different encounter. There Elizabeth lies beneath a monument, transformed into stone and inscription. The Queen is fixed again, no longer aging, no longer ill, no longer angry, no longer laughing. A tomb is another portrait. It gives permanence by removing movement. But the servant's Elizabeth was movement. She paced, she danced, she rode, she changed gowns. She turned away from unwanted papers. She struck a favourite or threatened to. She laughed at a joke. She spoke rapidly in several languages. She sat awake. She refused to lie down. Stone cannot show any of it. Neither can the famous portraits. The portraits do something else. They show us what the Queen wanted the world to remember. The servant's missing testimony represents what the world was not supposed to see. Between those two forms of evidence lies the real woman. Not fully recoverable, never completely visible. That uncertainty should make the story more compelling, not less. There is a temptation in historical storytelling to replace uncertainty with sensation. If we do not know exactly what Elizabeth's aging face looked like without cosmetics, it is easy to invent a horrifying one. If we do not know precisely what attendants said after Essex's intrusion, it is easy to create a dramatic confrontation. If we lack details of the final illness, it is easy to fill the room with supernatural terror. But the documented world is already powerful. A woman survives smallpox and bears marks that must be politically managed. An unmarried queen ages while her portraits remain young. A favourite enters her room before she is ceremonially prepared and discovers the private body behind the public image. Women close to her are punished for secret marriages. Servants navigate assassination fears and factional rivalry. An old monarch sits in melancholy while ministers quietly prepare for her successor. Attendants watch the person who has ruled them for 44 years stop breathing. No ghost is required. The horror is mortality under observation. Elizabeth could not age privately. She could not be sick privately. She could not love privately. She could not grieve privately. She could not die privately. Every human experience was converted into information that other people might use. The servants were both protectors and witnesses of that conversion. Some surely loved her, some probably feared her, some may have disliked her, some simply needed wages. We should resist turning them into a single chorus. A royal household contained different ranks, ambitions, loyalties, religions, family ties, and personalities. One attendant could experience the Queen's anger as terrifying injustice. Another could interpret the same anger as necessary discipline. A Protestant servant might view Elizabeth as the protector of true religion. A Catholic servant might outwardly conform while privately grieving the old faith. A young woman might admire the Queen's independence. Another might resent her control over marriage. The household was England in miniature, divided, dependent, ambitious, fearful, fascinated by its ruler. That complexity matters because Elizabeth's reign itself resists simple judgment. She helped stabilize a kingdom after violent religious changes, but her government persecuted Catholics it regarded as dangerous and also suppressed radical Protestant dissent. She inspired loyalty and used harsh punishment. She avoided many unnecessary wars early in her reign, but later became deeply involved in conflict abroad and in Ireland. She could be cautious to the point of frustration and bold at moments of crisis. She celebrated herself as mother of her people, while leaving no child and no publicly named heir. She was a woman who used gender brilliantly, while also enforcing the hierarchies of her age. Her servants saw these contradictions before historians named them. They existed in the Queen's daily behaviour. She could praise female chastity and enjoy flirtatious attention. She could insist on loyalty and keep secrets from her closest counsellors. She could condemn unauthorised marriage while negotiating her own for decades. She could present herself as unchanging while constantly adapting. Contradiction was not a flaw in the system, it was how she survived. The people in her chamber learned to survive the same way. They learned when to speak and when to be silent, when to look and when to pretend not to see, when to remember and when to behave as though they had forgotten, when to tell the Queen the truth and when to soften it, when to pass on a rumour and when to kill it at the door. A servant's greatest skill may have been knowing which reality the room required. The public queen required one reality. The sick queen required another. The angry queen another. The grieving queen another. The dying queen finally required none of the old illusions, but the court continued producing them until the funeral. That is why the image of attendants removing the queen's ceremonial layers is so revealing. At night, each object came away. A brooch returned to a box. Pearls were counted, sleeves were loosened, the ruff was removed, hair was unpinned. Cosmetics, whatever precise form they took on that day, could be cleaned away. The sovereign body grew smaller as the costume disappeared. Then mourning reversed the process. The state was assembled again. For 44 years this happened thousands of times. Thousands of private dismantlings, thousands of public reconstructions. The servants were the only people who saw both with regularity. That was the secret behind Elizabeth's closed doors. Not a single horrifying revelation, a repetition. The repeated discovery that the supposedly timeless queen was changing every day. The repeated knowledge that a woman praised as almost divine could be tired, frightened, ill, jealous, lonely, and in pain. The repeated responsibility of hiding ordinary humanity, because ordinary humanity could destabilize extraordinary power. And in the final weeks, the repetition broke. There was no next public reconstruction, no next gown, no next progress, no next New Year's gift exchange, no next ambassador waiting to be impressed. The servants who had spent their lives making Elizabeth visible to others became the first people forced to understand that she was gone. After the funeral, the rooms changed hands. Furniture moved. Textiles were stored, distributed, reused, or lost. Clothes that had once touched the Queen became property, gifts, fragments, memory. Paper survived unevenly. Palaces burned or were demolished. Families preserved some objects and discarded others. The hidden world broke apart. That destruction is why the smallest surviving trace can feel astonishing today. An embroidered cloth, a line in an inventory, a signature, a ring with a tradition attached to it, a letter marked as the last from someone beloved, a servant's monument in a parish church. Each object is a door handle without the door. We touch it and imagine the room. Perhaps that is the closest we can come to what Elizabeth's servants knew. Not by believing every lurid story, but by reconstructing the conditions that made secrecy necessary. A queen whose mother was executed, a princess who had been imprisoned, a Protestant ruler threatened by plots, an unmarried woman whose fertility became parliamentary business, a survivor of smallpox whose face became political imagery, an aging monarch surrounded by portraits that refused to age, a lonely ruler who depended on servants to create the appearance of independence. When those conditions are placed together, the closed door makes sense. So does the fear behind it. The servants did not merely protect Elizabeth from the world. They protected the world from Elizabeth's vulnerability. Because if the court saw too much weakness, factions might move. If foreign ambassadors learned too much, governments might gamble. If succession rumours became certainty, loyalties might shift. If private anger escaped, careers could collapse. If private affection became public, policy might be questioned. The body of one woman sat at the centre of a political system, and servants guarded the boundary between that body and everyone waiting outside. It was an impossible job. They succeeded often enough that the image still dominates 4 centuries later. We remember the white face, the red hair, the pearls, the enormous dresses, the armada, the speech at Tilbury, the Virgin Queen. We rarely remember the hands fastening the pearls. That omission tells us something important about power. Power wants to look self-created. It is not. Every throne stands on hidden labour. Every public image has a backstage. Every great ruler depends on people who know where the bodies ache, which doors stick, which lies must be maintained, and which truths must never leave the room. Elizabeth I's servants lived closer to that truth than almost anyone. What they saw behind closed doors was horrifying, not because they discovered that the Queen was secretly inhuman. It was horrifying because they discovered, day after day, that she was completely human, and that an entire kingdom depended on pretending otherwise. Today, visitors stand before Elizabeth's portraits in galleries and see the finished illusion. The paint is silent, the pearls do not move, the face does not age. The Queen stares back with the impossible calm of someone who will never again become sick, angry, exhausted, or afraid. But somewhere beyond the edge of the frame, history asks us to imagine the servant. A woman holding a pin, a man carrying a sealed letter, a laundress lifting wet linen, a page waiting beside a dark corridor, a physician entering quietly, an attendant standing beside a dying queen. They saw the portrait before it became a portrait. They saw the legend before it became legend. They saw the morning face and the midnight face. They saw the Queen when England was not looking. And in that hidden space, the most powerful woman in the kingdom became what every ruler eventually becomes when the doors close and the ceremony ends. A mortal body dependent on other mortal hands. That is the truth the portraits cannot hide forever. And perhaps the most revealing way to understand that hidden world is to imagine not one scandal, but the career of a servant who stayed long enough to watch the transformation. She enters royal service when Elizabeth is still young. The Queen moves quickly. She dances late. She rides hard. Her laughter carries through the chamber. Marriage proposals arrive from across Europe, and every arrival seems to carry the possibility that the entire structure of the household may change. Will there be a king beside her? Will there be children? Will the women who attend her become attendants to a royal nursery? No one knows. The servant learns the queen's preferences, which gloves she likes, which scent she rejects, which gown irritates her shoulders, which courtier can make her smile after a difficult council meeting, which political subject must never be introduced before breakfast. Then smallpox comes. The servant sees the young queen reduced to fever and uncertainty. The court begins calculating succession before the patient has recovered. The servant may hear men outside the room discussing the future, while inside the queen struggles simply to remain alive. Elizabeth survives. The household rejoices. The years continue. The servant watches Dudley rise, watches scandal gather around him, watches the queen refuse marriage again and again. She learns that royal affection is never safe, because everyone else assigns meaning to it. She watches Mary, Queen of Scots, become a prisoner whose name can alter the temperature of a room. She sees Walsingham's papers arrive. She hears of plots. She notices security becoming stricter. Perhaps she becomes suspicious of unfamiliar servants herself. Then comes the Armada summer. The palace fills with reports. Men speak too quickly, ships are counted, troops gather. The Queen prepares for Tilbury. The servant fastens part of the costume that will later become national memory. She sees fear before courage is displayed. She sees the Queen return alive. Then the old companions begin dying. The servant grows older too. Her own hands become less steady. Younger women enter the chamber and learn routines that once belonged to her. The Queen's face changes. New wigs appear. More care goes into presentation. A tooth causes trouble. The dresses seem heavier than they once did. Yet the compliments become more extravagant. That contradiction may be the strangest thing of all. The servant hears a young man compare the aging queen to a goddess of eternal beauty. She has just helped the same queen through a painful mourning. She knows the statement is not literally true. The young man knows it is not literally true. Elizabeth knows it is not literally true. And still, everyone behaves as though truth depends on repeating it. That is court culture at its most revealing. Not everyone is deceived. Everyone is participating. The servant understands that the performance itself has become reality. Then Essex bursts into the Queen's private space before the morning transformation is complete. Perhaps our imagined long-serving attendant is there. If she is, she witnesses something rare. A courtier crossing the boundary she has spent decades maintaining. The scandal is not that Elizabeth looks monstrous. The scandal is that he has refused the rules that protect the monarch from being seen without political preparation. A servant understands those rules instinctively because she builds them every day. A favourite believes intimacy gives him permission to ignore them. He is wrong. Soon he is ruined. Then he is dead. The servant watches Elizabeth after the execution and realises there are victories no one celebrates. More time passes. The Queen speaks to Parliament about the love of her people. The servant hears applause. Later she helps remove the ceremonial clothing. The body underneath is older than the image the members of Parliament carried home in their minds. Finally comes Richmond. The servant has seen the Queen sick before, but this illness feels different. Elizabeth does not recover between bad days. She does not suddenly demand music and return to business with familiar energy. She sits. She grows weaker. The people outside the room become quieter, not louder. That is how the servant knows. Not because a physician announces death, because the palace begins behaving like a place already waiting for it. Then the Queen dies. Our imagined servant has spent most of her adult life learning one person's habits in microscopic detail. In a single morning, all that knowledge becomes memory. This imagined career is not the biography of one documented individual. It is a way of combining the kinds of experiences that long-serving members of Elizabeth's household could have encountered across her reign. It reveals why service could be so emotionally intense. The servant did not watch history from a balcony. She watched it at arm's length. The great events entered the room as physical changes. War became sleeplessness. Assassination plots became locked doors. Diplomacy became a gown selected for an ambassador. Succession became physicians whispering near a bed. Aging became a pin placed more carefully than the year before. Death became silence where a command should have been. That scale is easy to lose when we speak of the Tudor state. States sound abstract, households are not. A state may issue a proclamation, but a servant carries it. A queen may symbolise England, but someone washes the linen she leaves behind. The private household reminds us that political history is always built from physical acts. It also changes the meaning of the word horrifying. The most frightening thing behind Elizabeth's closed doors was not filth, although palaces could be dirty. It was not cosmetics, although some period cosmetics were dangerous. It was not secret sexual scandal, despite centuries of rumour. It was not a grotesque hidden face waiting beneath paint. It was dependence. The monarch depended on servants. The servants depended on the monarch. The kingdom depended on the monarch appearing strong. And the monarch depended on the servants hiding every moment when strength failed. Everyone was trapped inside the same performance, for different reasons. That is why the story still feels modern. We continue to construct public people from controlled images. We continue to mistake presentation for personality. We continue to be shocked when powerful figures reveal ordinary weakness. We still reward the illusion that authority means self-sufficiency. Elizabeth's servants knew better. They knew power needed help putting on its shoes. They knew majesty needed someone to close the curtains. They knew immortality needed fresh linen. They knew the Virgin Queen grew old. And when the last door closed at Richmond in March 1603, they knew before almost anyone else that the performance had ended. The kingdom would continue. The portraits would survive. The legend would grow. But the people who had seen Elizabeth closest carried away a different queen in memory. Not the flat white face beneath pearls, but a changing human being whose greatest triumph may have been convincing generations that she had never changed at all.